Hello, and welcome to all who are joining this incredible evening. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Southern California in North America, in the United States. It's the ancestral land of the Tongva people. And I'm super grateful to be able to honor their stewardship and care of this great land, past, present, and future. This program is being live streamed or live captioned also in English and Spanish, and you can find the link to the YouTube description or in the YouTube description, and it will be in the comments if you're watching us on Facebook Live. I am Sandra Jackson-Dumont, and I am the Director and CEO of the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. Through visual storytelling, the Lucas Museum will expand the role of art and museums for society, and the museum as a whole inspires thought-provoking ideas and conversations that are relevant within and beyond the geographic boundaries that we sit in. Our work, we plan on it to radiate to catalyze more connected and empathetic spaces. We are a museum dedicated to the art of visual storytelling. And we are very excited that our vision is that the art of storytelling will connect us to shape a more just society. So it is in this spirit that we're having this conversation tonight or today, depending on where you are. Joining me are two brilliant, incredible people who are both scholars whose introduction I will share briefly, but in the interest of time, I don't want to dive in too deeply about who they are because you can actually Google them. But in the interest of time, let me introduce the Lucas Museum's Chief Curator and Deputy Director of Curatorial and Collections. Her name is Pilar Tompkins Rivas. She oversees exhibitions, acquisitions, collections management, archives, and publications. She is a leader in contemporary Latinx art and art history and art historical scholarship related to this area. She is very devoted to expanding the canon of art history to be much more inclusive and dynamic. And she has played a pivotal role in so many things, but at this pivotal moment in her earlier career, she actually worked with Judy Baca and was her studio assistant and archivist. So this is super exciting to peel back the layers of their relationship. UCLA professor and legendary feminist Chicana artist, community activist, and educator. She is so incredible. Judy Baca founded was a founder of the City of Los Angeles Mural program in 1974. Just brilliant. If you ever walked around Los Angeles, you would just be blown away if you don't live here. It evolved into a still thriving community arts program, an organization known as the Social and Public Art Resource Center, SPARC, where she currently serves as the artistic director. Professor Baca spearheaded the making of the iconic work of narrative art known as the Great Wall of Los Angeles. The inspiration for tonight's program was the recent announcement that she and her collaborators were awarded a $5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation to expand the scope of this half-mile long mural project, or this public mural, almost institution, I would say. So to ground our conversation today, I'm going to show you a few images of this epic and landmark work of art. It itself is not just a landmark work of art, but it is a landmark itself. And so you'll see some images come up. So the Great Wall of Los Angeles is located in the Tujunga Wash of the LA River, northeast of downtown Los Angeles. It was made over several years in collaboration with hundreds of community members, including scholars, activists, artists, and local youth. Someone found out that we recently acquired the archive, and they said, "Oh my God, I worked on that." Someone that lives in my neighborhood, which was so exciting. They said that they worked on it as a young person. In 2018, the Lucas Museum acquired the History of California archive, over 350 objects relating to this particular project that we'll hear about today. And the archive tells the story of the making of the mural and preserves the history of this important Los Angeles landmark. There's so much that I can say here, but in the interest of time, I will just say that currently the mural depicts narratives from the prehistory of Los Angeles through the 1950s, and the Mellon Foundation grant will allow the stories that this great work tells to be extended into the present for future generations. So hopefully you'll find yourselves down there watching the expansion of this. So join me in welcoming these amazing people. Judy and Pilar, Professor Baca, I should say, and Pilar, because I get to see you every day. I'm thrilled to be sitting with you today or tonight to talk about this amazing project and its archive and the significance of mural making to Los Angeles. But moreover, can you talk to me about the power of murals as a narrative art form? Like, this is pretty incredible. So, Judy, either one of you can go first.
Either one of us. Well, the narrative form, the form of muralism is a very powerful form because it takes the imagery to the places that people live and work, and it doesn't require people to make a trip to a kind of a sacred space, a white box. That means that you could walk outside your door, or you could go to the little mercadito in the corner, and you could see something that is about the story of your own community and your own family's life. I began to be very interested in the narrative work when I started thinking, I want to make work that is for my family and for my life experience. And how do I do that? How does it get to them? And I knew that, most of my family hadn't gone to a museum. They didn't know about the art world, that in fact, the language of visual arts that I was trained in, which was kind of a minimalist art in the 1970s, and, the op art and the, pop art kind of period, would have no relationship to the people I loved most. Mm-hmm. So I began to think about, how do I get it? How do I talk to these people? And that's how I came to the conclusion that there was use of the outside walls already, with young people writing on them. They're creating roll calls in the public spaces so they would know who they hung with, and what neighborhood they came from. And I thought, they're only a few paragraphs away from saying more than yo soy flaco, I'm skinny guy, right? But I am also, a descendant of, the Mexicas, and that this land was once Mexico. So I became very interested in how could I put that dialogue together. That's how I came to muralism. I actually came to it through graffiti and street work. And later I began to study, and I studied in Mexico with the Mexican muralists and in the tradition of Mexican muralism.
Mm-hmm. I was so privileged to meet Judy when I first moved to Los Angeles. Actually, even before I moved to LA, I met Judy, and that was one of the reasons why I stayed here. And I was a young muralist growing up in Texas, and was so moved by the power of public art from a very young age. And speaking to your comment, Judy, about just the tradition of Mexican muralism and why that's very significant for me personally. I went to Mexico City and saw the Palacio Nacional murals by Diego Rivera as a teenager, and it changed my life. Actually, to be honest, that murals as a form of history telling, as a form of talking about culture, encapsulating culture in a visual way that was meant to move beyond words, move outside of an academic context, and be something that the general public could connect to and learn from, was something that really struck me so deeply. And I really wanted to think about how art could be used for social change and how it could be made accessible outside of the strictures of sanctified places that people wouldn't ordinarily visit, and that really put me on a path early in my years to really care deeply about muralism and public art. And as a 20-something, when I moved to LA, I met Judy, And she was my introduction to Los Angeles and my introduction to art in LA. And just to back up, I wasn't her archivist or studio assistant specifically, but she invited me to work on the restoration of another incredible project, the World Wall, which I know Judy probably would be best to speak about, but Judy's vision of how murals can encapsulate numerous histories, multiple communities, and be a practice that is rooted in community is something that I feel really strongly about, and helped to shape my vision of what I now do.
Mm-hmm. She's modest because she was actually quite a good painter.
Yes.
Pilar handles a brush very well.
Nice.
Not anymore, but I did.
So Judy, can you talk a little bit about how you decided to include certain stories? Talk a little bit about your choices, and even before you answer that question, maybe you could talk about the importance of an archive in terms of like sustaining and encapsulating a narrative.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like there's so many artists that actually have not necessarily committed to the sustaining of an archive and making sure that they're documenting the process along the way. And there is such intentionality here that when people see this archive unfold at the Lucas Museum, they're going to see like just as how beautifully this is documented and cared for as a narrative in and of itself. Can you talk a little bit about your intentionality there?
It's sort of like I didn't really realize what I was doing. You know what I mean? I really didn't have a clear understanding of the value of the archive when I began it, but I do. It was in the middle of a movement, both the Chicano movement, the civil rights movement, and the feminist movement. And I have to say that Judy Chicago, one point said to me, Judy, she used to call me Judy B, and she's Judy C, right? So she'd say, Judy B? I said, what, Judy C? And she'd say, you have to document, you have to preserve your own history because nobody else will. And so I thought, wow, that just really hit me. Like, I have to make this work and then I have to preserve it too. That's way too much. Then I have to fundraise for it. And then I have to, put all the structure in place to actually house it. All of that. And I wasn't ready for that. I was really ready for the pleasure of, working at scale. And I think that's one of the things about the narrative form and the mural form. It's like creating these images at scale that take tremendous power that your entire body fit inside of, right? I was really excited about that. But I started to, collect materials as I was developing it. You have to remember that in 74, when I began to think about the Great Wall, there were not a tremendous number of ethnic studies programs. There were not books written about Black history and, Latino history and Asian history that were simply to be pulled and culled and brought down from the shelves and used as the source for this material. So I ended up having to go to people and saying, so what was the most significant thing that was happening during your period? And then I started getting these kind of thoughts from people in which they would say, you cannot talk about the 1920s, without talking about in African-American history, without, these particular events. And so I started to, call this information from first source materials. And so I ended up talking with some of the most amazing people. I mean, I got to, in doing the 50s pieces, I spoke with Mrs. Laws, who broke the Black Covenant laws in Los Angeles. I had these opportunities to be in relationship to soldiers who came back from World War II and then couldn't find housing in Los Angeles because they were of the restricted housing. And I said, what was it like? And they told me stories. And as these stories were gathered, I started thinking, these are so precious. How do I keep our recording of these ideas? And they used to go into boxes, and photographs would go into boxes, and they would go into shelves. And as the years evolved, we began to digitize, and we began to organize materials in a much more systemic way. And then with the support of 2 graduate students from USC who came in and they organized my tias and my mother, and they got everybody in the room. That's Cesar Lopez and Adriana Chavarin. They went into the space and they started collecting all this material. And they said, we want every drawing. I said, oh, there's thousands of them. They're just a bunch of them, you know. And so they started to collect them. And as they organized that material, I started to see, and I started to see the value. And I honestly, I didn't really understand it entirely until Don Baca Calupi, who came to see me, who got me, and you know, he was amazing at the beginning of the Narrative Museum in terms of seeing this work and had a vision for what this work could be. And I started organizing it. And there, after years, it revealed itself. I saw the first thought. Oh my God, this is when we were thinking about Chavez Ravine. And I thought of it as a spaceship, you know, descending into the first Mexican part of the city of Los Angeles, you know. And I thought, okay, it's Close Encounters of the Third Kind was the movie that was out. So I was joking around and I made a spaceship come down into that area. And we were playing back and forth with, you know, another artist and I, who actually, you know, is now a Pulitzer Prize winner, Matt Worker, who was a cartoonist, and he could conceptualize something like that, you know, for a cartoon. And so we went back and forth and I could see exactly the evolution of an idea that became a final image, that became the coloration that you showed, that became the actual stuff that went to the wall and then was painted. So I started, I guess the notion of archiving was a way of tracing process. It was a way of, you know, gathering material and keeping it, realizing that some of this material was as precious as the final image. And I began to have a very great respect for the process of archiving and preparing for the collection by the Lucas collection was an amazing experience for me. It was kind of overwhelming. I had never looked at it sequentially and all together.
But it's really incredible to think about that, because I think in seeing kind of what's in the archive, you start to realize, well, I just assumed that you had been thinking about this from the very beginning because it's so beautifully done. But also, maybe you could say a few words about how you decided to include certain stories. Like how did you go about deciding what was ultimately included? What narrative to include?
Well, partially it was, I mean, there is a complete sort of outline of a process which begins first with, you know, kind of analytical research from a particular decade. And, you know, like I'm just thinking about the 1930s or the 1940s and, you know, doing an analysis and having it from the perspective of various peoples, beginning with you know, the analysis that comes from historians and people who've made studies of a particular era, but then also from people who lived through the experience. And also by virtue of looking at what their status was, their immigration status, their age, their ethnicity, their gender, all of those things affected the way the history was interpreted or what they valued, right? And then I started to see, oh, you can't talk about this, period, without including these ideas. And people would say to me, you can't do this, Judy, without this. And then I started putting down what came up over and over again, because it wasn't just those people who had the scholarship, but it was also the people themselves, the people that are in our communities, the people who lived through, you know, the dislocation in Chavez Ravine, and the stories of them having to move when Dodger Stater came in, and what that fight was like, because they will come back with memories that are vivid of that moment, and those become metaphors. I'll give you an example: the Fighting for 42nd. I interviewed one of the last of the Fighting for 42nd from, you know, recruited from the Japanese internment camps. So here is a Japanese man who's in the internment, he's in Manzanar, and he is going into infantry and fighting for our country, but he is a prisoner, essentially, right? And the desire to prove that they were really Americans was so deep ingrained in him. And when he was talking to me at one point, he turned to me and he said, Judy, we were the very fabric of America. And that is what I kept saying, fabric of America, fabric of America. He's essentially the American flag. So the image of the fabric of America character is the stripes of the American flags turning into the fighting 442nd and the figures of these Japanese men coming out of the internment camps to become the most decorated infantry group in the US during World War II. You know, so it was about those stories that people told me, and then honoring those as the privileged information. In other words, what if you privilege it backwards? Right? But it's really the right way. It's not backwards, but it is what history books would privilege it in a different way.
Well, you're mentioning history books, and I think it's so incredible that one could actually walk the entire mural and actually learn history in a dynamic way. And, you know, should probably be every young person in LA should experience history through the lens of this wall. So I want to bring Pilar into this conversation because Pilar, I mean, you're such kind of I talked to Pilar off to the side, Judy, and she just is like, it was so amazing to work with her. I mean, it was amazing. So we got off of our last call and I was like, I can't believe we were talking to Judy Baca. She's amazing.
I'm very flattered. I'm really always shocked about the impact it's had. You know, I was painting down there in the sewer, as the kids called it, the sewer, right? And probably the most humble and most difficult site ever to paint a mural in. And a lot of times it felt like nobody cared, and you know, it really didn't matter, except that all of a sudden you turn around and there would be all these people saying, you put the wrong term up there. You said, 500,000 Mexicans deported. We weren't Mexicans. We were Americans. We were Mexican Americans. So you have to change that. And there were all these people standing up there like, older women. I'm going, okay. So I was corrected along the way because I was talking about people's experience and people were engaged. And I'm always shocked by that. Really, it's like, wow.
Yeah, I mean, and for those of us that weren't there, were truly impacted by it. So like Pilar, maybe you can talk about what makes the Great Wall of Los Angeles, a rich work of narrative art and how it relates to your curatorial perspective that you're bringing to the Lucas Museum, because I think it's such an interesting and important part of kind of your professional growth and your personal, growth as well. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Oh, yes. All of the above. I mean, again, I want to, say how much Judy's influenced my thinking from an early age of coming to Los Angeles and understanding that there are many stories that are underrepresented, and that California and Los Angeles specifically is like a palimpsest of multiple histories that are on top of each other, multiple communities that intersect, and this mural specifically tells the story of the African American experience, the Japanese American experience, the Mexican American and Chicano experience, the LGBTQ, experience, all and the perspective of women in the workforce during World War II, and then being, turning into homemakers in the 1950s. And I mean, it's just this interwoven dialogue that brings different groups together that whose stories we're still fighting to tell to this day. I mean, these are the narratives that need to be told and understood. I mean, the mural is as relevant today as it ever was. And in that we are still fighting these fights. This is, the stories that are embedded within that mural are the same issues that we still contend with today. And I think that there's a power in focusing a museum on narrative so that we can address this directly and talk about it really specifically, unpack these histories. That's the kind of work that I've been striving to do in my curatorial practice. And then before that, as an artist myself, it's what I really cared about and what I really valued. And, when I learned in our early conversations about me potentially coming here, I think in the first call, I learned that this archive was at the museum. I was like, wow, I know I'm in the right place. And I did get a chance to go through the entire archive when we were doing research for the exhibition LA Chicano. That was the first Getty's Pacific Standard Time looking at post-war art in LA. And so I don't know how many days and hours I spent in the archives, but I did go through every single object in there. And we did include a number of the works in the exhibition, but I had a lot of time with it prior to coming to the museum. So I knew it well. And I think there's so many different things that it connects to, not only in terms of mural, a public art practice, but I think with that, and Judy, of course, through Spark and your Neighborhood Pride program, you created a process of working collaboratively with people from the community that makes art of an art of the people, an art that is really inclusive of the voices, as you were just describing. You have to start by talking to people and really by listening, start by listening and then going from there. So I think that idea that it's not, the archive isn't just the process of making the mural, but it speaks to this larger process of art practice, which, we've also talked about today as social practice. That's something that can be embedded in a community and function in a different way outside of a singular solo studio practice. But at the same time, one of the things I love about it is that Judy's experience in Mexico and working at the Taller Siqueiros and how that influenced her practice during the production of the mural also speaks to the transnational connections in art history that I think are really significant and important to bring about, especially when we're thinking about the history of Chicano art and tying that to an international context for art making.
Yeah. And thank you so much for that, Pilar.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Judy.
Oh, I was just saying thank you, Pilar. She kind of encapsulated a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Judy, and Pilar, you kind of teetered in this territory. At the intersection, maybe you could talk a little bit about the intersection of, social justice and your artistic practice, and how, there's a lot of conversations about how those intersect now by museums, when there are entire generations of people, yourself included, that actually, were doing this work really to infiltrate museums on so many levels. I'm thrilled to say that we're going to be one of those museums that actually sits at that intersection wholly, where we're looking at kind of dismantling this notion of the high and the low. And I feel like this mural actually does that on so many levels. It really, really punches a hole in the cannon and actually honors the work of people that have been making works that have sat outside of that for so long. And so I would love to hear you talk about how community engagement, social justice, and your artistic practice kind of come together.
Oh, in so many different ways. And I think it's today in the climate that we are seeing it with social justice being brought to the fore to such a degree, and the interest that museums are beginning to have. I mean, it was like the Whitney just did this show on Mexican muralism, and I was hearing from people from all over New York and all of them saying, "Oh, we saw this show. We never really understood. Oh my God, it's like what amazing stuff." I mean, it's like, and yes, that's right. And yes, and haven't you been teaching about this for 35 years? I said, yes, I have. And probably I told you this story before too, right? In other words, it's people don't understand the degree in which work that was aimed at social justice, or actually included social justice, included people that were not skilled in having a kind of intellectual dialogue about more formalist aspects of the arts, should be included or were not included. It was actually completely thought of as not art. Actually, if you go back to the early times in terms of how people wrote about me or described me, I was everything from, people thought I was a gang member. I mean, that I had gang members on the team, so therefore I was one. People thought that I was a youth worker or an educator, but very rarely was I called an artist, because my practice stood outside of what was the realm of a traditional visual artist. And I remember, thinking, okay, we'll never break this notion. We will never do that. It's always about the marketplace, essentially. It's just about going down to the marketplace. But I kept saying to myself, I don't want to be in the mainstream. I want to be a tributary that grows so strong that I overcome the mainstream. And I want to do that with all of my people. And I kind of feel like, is it happening? Maybe it's happening, right? Maybe we're beginning to make traction, and we're beginning to say, this is who we are as Americans, and this is what we contributed. And it actually goes back to my understanding, really, from a really dear friend of mine who I was listening to her family speak, and they were, a family that was really an intellectual family, a family from Harvard, and I was in the East Coast, and they were sitting around talking, and they were talking about their families. And well, my great grandfather came over on the Mayflower. And then I thought, this is what my kids don't have. They don't know when their great grandfather came, or when they made that crossing. And like when my family came into the United States, there was really no border, right? People moved back and forth without a line. And so I thought, what we need to do is give back that power to people by knowing who you are and beginning to understand from that positionality what you could contribute and to be valued. So we're talking about self-esteem, the growth of self-esteem. We're talking about the recovery of ourselves. And that in itself is revolutionary. That's a revolution.
Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes, it is. My goodness. I mean, this idea of the role, Pilar and I often talk about this, like image actually, working in the world, but also working on people. They happen to us sometimes, and sometimes they happen around us, but they really are shaping the society in which we live. Pilar, can you talk a little bit about, and this is, everyone's going to love this because this is where I feel like Pilar sings, but can you speak to the significance of Judy's practice to Latinx communities? I mean, to art history more broadly also. This is where, Judy, you get to sit back and hear like the impact of your incredible work on the canon of art history.
Don't talk about how I pissed off the men.
Pilar, can you talk a little bit about how important this work is? I mean, it's and Judy herself, not just this mural, but her practice and how it's really changed the face and landscape of art history.
That's such an important question. I don't even know where to start, but I would say I want to start by actually saying that I think for the way that we can even begin to understand Chicana feminist art practice, you have to start by understanding Judy's work. It's the same as if you're going to understand Chicana critical theory, you have to understand Gloria Anzaldúa. These are kind of cornerstone benchmark individuals that help you to, from there, it's basically, I think of Judy like the core critical theory for understanding the field. And so, and that is a marker by which we understand and can orient ourselves within that history and that practice. And I'm thinking too, Judy, of the many things that you've had to fight for in order to be, in order to either be part of the canon or fight against other people that have threatened your artwork. I'm remembering, to the episode in the mid 2000s with your monument in San Gabriel Valley. And just, that fight has always had to be something that is, continually there. And I feel like the canon is only just starting to catch up. There have been many moments where, that push to I don't know, really expand what we understand as art history. It's happened, as Judy was saying early on, weren't talking about her art in the context of art history, or saying it's outside of that. And when I was around Judy more in my early years and still as a painter that painted narrative imagery that would talk about my family and my personal experiences, I experienced the same thing of people saying, well, that's not art, because you're not doing abstract expressionism, whatever it is that you're doing. So you had to continually fight to have a voice. And Judy paved the way for many generations of young people behind her. I think, not only within her art practice, but in her as an educator, for all those that she's brought into the fold, into thinking about narrativity, multiple histories, and through the work that she's done at UCLA and World Arts and Culture, and through the Digital Mural Lab at Spark, her practice is not only the mural practice in and of itself, but a pedagogy, if you will, a community practice, and something that we can really, ground in and orient ourselves when we want to begin to think about Chicano art history and Chicana feminist practice. Those are some of the things that immediately come to mind, but there's so much more.
Just to add to this thought, then 2000, when that attack occurred in Baldwin Park, it was a metro rail station that I had built, 12 or 14 years earlier. And those white supremacists came out. And essentially, it's very much the white supremacy that we're seeing now, that we saw in the attack on the legislature. I mean, in DC, they're the same people. But early on, they were drawn to take down a rather benign piece, because I put over the top of an arch. I sandblasted into the arch, it was better before they came, and it was a kind of reference to the missions, but it was actually something from that a man from Arkansas had said, and I was recording the voices of people from that community, and also other statements like, the kind of town that we want to live in with all these different racial groups. It was a wonderful piece because it was really connecting a monumental arch piece and a plaza to a place. And they thought that I was trying to give Baldwin Park back to Mexico. And they coined the phrase that I was a reconquista. And they went out on the media, literally, I had 7 feet of death threats. Was from something I built 12 years previous. So, and I kept saying, I'm going to write a biography, and it's going to say, I don't know why they're trying to kill me. It's only art.
That's how powerful it is, right?
Yep.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because you, well, let me just go back, because that's such a powerful thing that you said. Yeah. Art, we all know that art moves people. It can move people to think, reflect, but for better or for worse, it can also move people to act, right, and do. And so I'm interested in knowing from the both of you, kind of like, what exactly do you feel this work does in the world, right? It actually is doing a significant amount of work. Like this mural is laboring on so many levels. And I would just love to hear how you think it's actually impacting young people, how you think it's impacting the people that were involved with it. Like, what does that look like and feel like? Because I think what we're going to see is even more of this. I think we're going to see people doing more of this. And I also think that leads to what I'm going to ask you to talk about, is what does the next chapter look like? But can you both maybe talk about that together a little bit?
Sure.
I wanted to say something first. I know, Judy, you have so much to say about this, but one of the things that I think that it's doing in the world is it's a precedent to so much of the solidarity, work that we see happening today. I feel, especially in the past year, this kind of galvanized push for people across communities to work together in a really specific way for social justice. And knowing that the mural was done, decades earlier, or that the bulk of the work was done in a different time, and with young people who are now looking back and saying how much it impacted their lives. I mean, I think it speaks to the fact that this work has been around, that this work has always been there, that there's been it gives a history to current conversations, where you can kind of get some footing and say not only have we been trying to talk about these issues for a long time, and you can't say it louder than half a mile. It's before the internet and social media. It's like, you got to say it big.
Yeah.
That was the best option. You couldn't just say it on Instagram and hashtag it over and over again. You have to, it's like, let's take up a half mile and say it as loudly as we possibly can. We got to take up space, occupy space,
Exactly.
and be present and show that we're here. That's the way that it's turning out. And then, the other part to it too is, muralism in and of itself, and especially in Los Angeles, I talked a little bit about some of the things you've had to fight for, but preservation of that mural, keeping it alive, keeping it physically there, keeping it, graffiti free and in good condition, and the restoration of it, fighting for the funds to have it have longevity for the next 100 years or longer. I mean, that's a goal, right? That's what we want to see as a monument. That's the kind of monument that I want to see. That's the kind of monument that I want to live with. A monument that speaks to the stories of the diverse communities of California, this area.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Judy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I have to say that one of the things is that I grew up alongside the Los Angeles River. I was born in Watts, and at that time, Watts at 85th and Central, and to a single mother. And in Watts, it was pretty much a Black community, and at that time, it's now almost all entirely Latino. And then, as my mother wanted us to become more upwardly mobile, and she married my stepfather, we moved to the San Fernando Valley, and that was to be middle-class suburbia. But because my mom went out and the Black Covenant laws restricted housing for Mexicans, we ended up in a place called Pacoima. Pacoima is another indigenous word. Pacoima was a Black and brown community. So I grew up in these communities that had history of interracial strife. I mean, that our schools were closed because of the conflicts between Black and Latino kids, and there was, the busing issues of people being bused. And in fact, Los Angeles is an incredibly segregated city. No one speaks about it, but it is in fact a very segregated city. So I grew up alongside of the river, and I watched it turn to concrete. We used to play in these open spaces, and as they concreted the river, because in fact, very early on, the city fathers realized that real estate was really important in Los Angeles, and that we couldn't have this river go meandering out from its borders as it did in the winter and then be contracted during the summer, that we had to restrict it. So it had to be tamed. The river had to be tamed. And then it became concreted. And as it became concreted, I saw that as the hardening of the arteries of the land. All these metaphors became really clear to me. And I saw the channel have two dirt belts on either side of it, and this division of communities occur because of it. And so I really thought, well, I just think we should tear that river up, right? So I guess anything tearing up of the river would have made me a terrorist. So I couldn't exactly do that. I had to come up with some other options. I had to come up with options that were more acceptable. I said, so, why don't we tattoo that river? Why don't we tattoo the scar where the river once ran? That became the underlying metaphor of this piece. And so my interest really was the recovery of the river. And it seemed to me similar to the recovery of the people. I saw kids on poverty programs. My first monies were juvenile justice monies to pay for kids. And the other monies were monies that came from economically disadvantaged. But in those days, they said disadvantaged youth because they were people of color. You know, they didn't change it to economically disadvantaged till years later, but disadvantaged youth. And you know, we were talking about the founding of Los Angeles, the early Los Angeles, and a kid comes in with a land grant that his family actually owned part of Griffith Park. So the question is, how did you come to be in a poverty program when your family probably owned Griffith Park, right? So in my own research, I found that my family probably owned Denver. I mean, it was like, there's the Luisa Maria Baca land grant. I mean, it would be interesting to finally establish that relationship to that land grant that was, you know, the major part of Denver. And so what it is how did that trajectory occur? And that's what I thought was part of the story underlying the Great Wall, the recovery of the river, the recovery of our stories, and the understanding of how we came to be where we are and how we can recover from that and take agency and power in collaborating across race to begin to change our city, for the greater good. And that's really what the the Great Wall is about. It's about this notion that we have power together, that we, and I thought, okay, here's this place that is a terrible now concrete sewer where water runs to the ocean and pollutes the Santa Monica Bay. It runs too quickly. It doesn't go into the aquifer. It doesn't, do what it's supposed to do as it runs through the ground and gets cleaned. So how do we deal with the fact that this is happening in this river, and that it is, that the river itself is a metaphor for the change that we need to do, the connection between the Los Angeles River and us, right? And the people. So that's what the bottom line of this whole thing was, to go to this terrible site, a modest place, and speak from a very loud voice, from a place that was very modest. And no one would fight me about that space because they didn't care. So I went where people didn't care. They didn't care about the river, so I could paint it forever. And it's from that place that this voice is heard. So the gift from the melon is a miracle. It's nothing short of a miracle. And it's the brilliance of their new leadership.
I was just gonna say, actually, I don't know that it's a miracle. I think that, Elizabeth Alexander at the helm of the Mellon Foundation isn't a miracle. That's bound up. That means she is bound up with this work. She believes in this work. Like to do this work is to actually do good by herself. Deborah Cullen Morales over at the Mellon Foundation also is so committed to this work. And so we thank them for shining a light on it. I also just have to say that I'm so excited about this program because, even when I think about the LA River Project, like there's just so much attention being drawn to this, and to think that your work, like, also catalyzed so many of these discussions. Not just in the art realm, but in the social justice realm and the Chicana arts movement, and, and feminist, practice, for those of us that are women in the field, and those of us that just believe that this is important for the people to be present in all these spaces. You are like such an incredible gift to us all. And so, Judy, I just have to say, thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for one small little question. And I think, Pilar, you should ask Judy this final question, and then I'll wrap up. Any question you want.
What does she want to ask me?
Judy, it's actually going to be 20 years that I moved to LA, 20 years since I met you.
Oh my God, I can't believe it.
Can you believe it? It's been 20,
No, I can't believe it.
20 years. So time flies. And when I first met you and I was first exposed to this work, you were talking about the expansion and the extension of the mural. And at that time, and and I remember, if I'm not mistaken, that you said, well, I hope you're still in Los Angeles at that time so you can come and work on the mural. The expansion of the mural. And I was like, wow, that's a good reason to stay in LA. I hope it happens like next summer or like in 3 months.
Yeah, it's perseverance.
I guess my first question is, can I work on it with you? And then the second,
Absolutely.
But the second part was, has your vision for it and how you'll complete it or how you'll do this next phase changed over the past years while you have been, anticipating this kind of funding that needs to come in? And that, what do you really hope can be conveyed within this next part of the mural?
I think a lot about. I've been thinking a lot about it, obviously, for a number of years, and I almost felt that it was just not going to happen in my lifetime. That it would be the next generation that would do it. But what has changed profoundly is that the technology has advanced the way that we can do this, and we can actually work on substrates outside of the channel, and then actually adhere those substrates to the site, which eliminates all the danger. That's a very dangerous site. And I mean, in 1984, we had one of our people wash down the channel and she was rescued by a helicopter. And it was a sort of dramatic thing. And I got terrified. And the kids told me I was a coward because, hey, it was more dangerous to go to school than to work in the channel. I mean, but I was really afraid that I really needed to have much more in place, an upstream dam and everything to protect people. And the weather conditions have changed dramatically. So in the next realm, we're going to work interiorly. We're looking for a magnificently simple but big space, like an airplane hangar, to make the Great Wall Institute, to develop 350 feet at one time. And at that point, be able to paint that work and adhere them to the channel segment by segment. So that's the plan. And it's a much safer plan, but it also gives us the capacity to work year round. So it means we can do it much faster. So this is the first 3 years with the Mellon money will get us through the designing. The next 3 years, if we're successful and Mellon still likes us, we will get another 5 million to do the next segment, to paint the pieces and to put them into the channel. So that's the plan. It's a 10-year, it's actually a 6-year plan. And hopefully by the end of it, we're going to have another generation of painters and more leadership. And I can get old with some grace.
Oh, that's so wonderful. I have to, okay, so I lied. I'm going to ask a final question and then I'll close this out. So I have to ask you, when you think about the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art coming on board, what do you think the promise of a place like this is?
Oh, I was very excited when I learned of it, and very excited about the location. I actually began the very first City of Los Angeles mural program in the swim stadium across the way from you. That's where my home was. That was the first home of the first mural program. And also because of its proximity to so many hundreds of schools and the inner city, it's the perfect location. And also the other part of that is exciting is that it creates a kind of a center of energy with all of the other facilities that are there. When I was a child, we used to go to the gardens, the rose gardens there, and we'd take the trolley car there. So I have this long childhood memory of this particular place, and I think it has a great deal of possibility for absolutely changing the story. To change the story of Los Angeles, to engage people in a way that they have not been engaged with our major museums, and that it would bring in an entirely different population of Los Angeles. And that will be, or is, the majority population.
Wow. I think I feel like we should have a completely different session where all we talk about is the definition of narrative art, because I think that so so much of the discussion has been about what is it? And so we have 5 minutes left. It's only going to take me a minute to wrap it up. So do you want to take a stab at sharing your perspective on what narrative art is?
I would love to say a little bit about that, and I'm sure Pilar has some ideas about it too. But
Yeah.
I think narrative, the narrative story thing is that what I did is, when I was working on these pieces, I would bring people in to see them, and like they were ordinary workers, they weren't art world people, and I was trying to work at multiple levels on the designs. You know, a level that would be people who understood the arts, and that I was making a reference to Elizabeth Catlett or to Charles White. You know, I was bringing them up in the imagery, so you would know that these artists were the major influences, and I was making them present in the artwork. And then also to see the narrative through the eyes of an ordinary working class person. So I would take my stepfather down the wall. I say, Dad, what do you see? You know, or I would talk to one of the locals. I would say, you know, Jose, what do you see there? And then they would read it. They would read it back to me, right? And I brought other artists in to read back the sketches. And if they could tell the story by reading it, you know, well, there's Rosie the Riveter. She's getting sucked into a TV set by a woman with a vacuum cleaner, which means she can no longer work in the war industry. And look there's a perfect American family, 2 children. One of them is Howdy Doody, because that's the TV that's going on. And look at the big TV with the aerials everywhere. And look, it's a pink ghetto. And so they're reading it. Yeah. And they're understanding that we're making, in a sense, we've found our sense of humor, but we are also talking about the development of suburbia, right? Mm-hmm. So it's about, narrative to me means that you can read the story.
Nice. Nice.
You can retell it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. Makes total sense. Pilar, I can see you wanting to lean in here. And so we have a couple of minutes. I think you could take at least one of them.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly. I mean, I know that, you know, the museum has a long life ahead of it, and we're going to talk about what narrative art is over the next 100 years. So it's hard for me to sum it up in just a minute, but yeah. I think what Judy said is really critical to the way that we think about it, which is a kind of legibility and within an image, and also accessibility is what is the kind of what result of that legibility is that there's a notion that the museum and by focusing on narrative within art can be radically inclusive to all, and that there is an openness in foregrounding this type of artwork that can be readily read, can be readily understood, and it's engaging with a visual storytelling that is going to connect people to different histories, to you know, different types of stories that we want to uncover. We want to connect to have a reflection of the world that we live in, and I think that is a really powerful tool to see in action. And I'm so, of course, looking forward to being able to showcase the archive and tell the story of this mural and the multiple stories that it contains.
Thank you both so much. I mean, this has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you both for sharing your stories and your insights about, you know, this incredible moment and your relationship. I also want to thank Joe Rivera, who is this incredible ASL interpreter. I mean, this evening, he's saying this about himself. I'm such an incredible sign language interpreter. And Annabelle Fernandez for providing live closed captioning behind the scenes. I finally want to thank everyone who's joined us virtually. I also want to thank the incredible Lucas team that no one ever gets to see behind the scenes of these things, but they are doing a great job. A recorded version of this program will be posted on our YouTube channel over the next few weeks. So stay tuned, and please feel free to share with the family and friends. You can also find out more about Judy's work at sparkinla.org. Until next time, we hope that you value stories in the way that we do, because we believe that they are going to shape a more just society. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Pilar.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Absolutely.